The fluorescent lights flickered in the cramped conference room as FBI Director Catherine Mills slammed a manila folder onto the metal table. The old mill that woman inherited from her grandmother. It's not just storing grain anymore. Hidden inside are classified documents that could expose Operation Midnight Sun, compromising 30 years of national security and potentially triggering an international crisis. Assistant Director James Parker's face drained of color as Mills continued, "And the single mother who found these files. She has no idea she's holding secrets that could topple governments." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Torres wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stood in the parking lot of Henderson Elementary, watching her 2 children climb into her rusted Honda Civic. The September heat in rural Virginia felt oppressive, matching the weight of unpaid bills stuffed in her purse. At 32, Rebecca had imagined her life would look different, perhaps still married to her college sweetheart, maybe living in the suburban house they'd dreamed about, certainly not working double shifts at the local diner while studying for her nursing degree online. The divorce 3 years ago had shattered more than just her marriage. David's departure, along with his inconsistent child support payments, had left Rebecca scrambling to keep her family afloat. Her daughter Emma, now 10, had grown quiet and serious, often helping with 8-year-old Marcus when Rebecca worked late into the night. The guilt was a constant companion, but Rebecca pushed forward, driven by a fierce determination to give her children the stability she'd never had. "Mom, Mrs. Henderson says you need to sign my permission slip," Emma said, buckling her seatbelt with the practiced efficiency of a child who'd grown up fast. Rebecca's heart clenched. The field trip cost $25, money she didn't have after paying for Marcus's school supplies. "I'll look at it tonight, sweetheart," Rebecca replied, forcing a smile as she started the car. The engine coughed, before grudgingly turning over, and she made a mental note to add car repair to her growing list of expenses she couldn't afford. The call from the lawyer had come 3 weeks ago, completely out of the blue. "Mrs. Torres, I'm handling the estate of Vivian Blackwood. It appears you're listed as the sole beneficiary of her property on Mill Creek Road." Rebecca had been confused. She'd never heard of Vivian Blackwood, though the lawyer explained that Vivian was her late grandmother, Sarah's younger sister, a woman who'd lived as a recluse for decades. "There must be some mistake," Rebecca had protested. But the paperwork was clear. The old flour mill and surrounding 20 acres now belonged to her. The inheritance had felt surreal, almost like a cruel joke. Who inherits property from a relative they'd never met? But as the lawyer explained the tax implications and ongoing costs, Rebecca realized this gift might become another burden she couldn't afford. The mill had been abandoned for 40 years, probably condemned and worthless. Still, curiosity and desperate hope had driven her to visit the property on a Saturday morning when her neighbor could watch the kids. The gravel road leading to the mill was overgrown, weeds pushing through cracks that spoke of decades of neglect. When she first saw the building, Rebecca's heart sank. The 3-story stone structure looked like something from a horror movie. Broken windows, weather-stained walls, and a partially collapsed roof over what had once been the grain storage area. The mill wheel, still attached to the building, hung motionless and rusted, a monument to industrial decay. Vines had claimed most of the exterior walls, and the small creek that had once powered the operation now ran brown and sluggish. This wasn't valuable property. This was a liability waiting to happen. Rebecca had walked around the building, noting the condemned signs posted by the county, the broken stairs leading to the main entrance, the scattered debris that suggested vandals or scavengers had already picked through anything of value. Her practical mind catalogued the costs, demolition, environmental cleanup, property taxes she couldn't afford. Maybe she could sell it to some developer for a few $1,000s, enough to catch up on rent and fix her car. But something had stopped her from leaving immediately. Perhaps it was the way the afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting everything in golden hues that made the ruin look almost romantic. Or maybe it was the memory of her grandmother Sarah, who had died when Rebecca was 15, leaving behind stories of the family's past in Virginia that Rebecca had never really understood. Walking around the mill's perimeter, Rebecca noticed that one section of the building looked different, newer somehow, though still decades old. The stonework was cleaner, the mortar less weathered. It was on the far side, hidden from the main road, where a heavy wooden door stood partially ajar. Unlike the rest of the building, this area showed signs of recent maintenance. The hinges, while rusty, didn't squeal when she pushed the door open. The interior surprised her. Unlike the main mill area, which was filled with debris and water damage, this section was remarkably well preserved. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, and the floor, while dusty, was solid wood that had been recently sealed. Electrical lines ran along the walls, modern ones, not the original mill wiring. Rebecca's flashlight beam revealed something that made her heart race. The filing cabinets weren't old industrial equipment. They were newer, maybe from the 1960s or 70s, and they were locked with combination locks that looked expensive and sophisticated. This wasn't storage for grain or mill equipment. This was something else entirely. The first cabinet she managed to open using a crowbar from her car revealed files that made her blood run cold. Folder after folder of documents marked classified, top secret, and eyes only. Names she recognized from history books, operations she'd never heard of, budgets that ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Operation Midnight Sun, Operation Silver Shield, Operation Ghost Walker. Each file contained hundreds of pages of documents, photographs, and correspondence that seemed to span from the late 1950s through the early 1990s. These weren't copies. They were originals, with signatures, official seals, and handwritten notes in the margins. Rebecca's hands shook as she opened file after file. Financial records showing payments to foreign operatives, photographs of meetings between American officials and people her untrained eye couldn't identify, but who looked important and nervous. Technical specifications for weapon systems she'd never heard of. Lists of names with notations like eliminated, compromised, and relocated. One file made her stomach turn. Operation Midnight Sun appeared to be a psychological warfare program that used American citizens as unwitting test subjects. The documents detailed experiments conducted in psychiatric hospitals, prisons, and even some colleges. People had been drugged, subjected to extreme psychological manipulation, and in some cases killed, all without their knowledge or consent. Another folder contained financial records showing how the CIA had funded South American dictatorships, provided weapons to both sides of conflicts to maximize instability, and laundered money through American corporations, some of which were still in business today. But it was the photographs that truly horrified her. Images of what appeared to be American soldiers executing unarmed civilians. Documents proving that high-ranking officials had knowledge of war crimes and had actively covered them up. Evidence of assassination plots against foreign leaders and against American citizens who had threatened to expose these operations. Rebecca realized she was holding proof of crimes that would implicate some of the most powerful people in American government, past and present. People who were still alive, still in positions of power, still capable of making her disappear if they knew what she'd found. Her phone showed no signal in the mill, which seemed ominous given what she'd discovered. As she photographed page after page with her phone, Rebecca's mind raced with questions. How had these files ended up here? Who was Vivian Blackwood really? And why had this cache of deadly secrets been left to her? The more she read, the clearer it became that these weren't just random classified documents. They were insurance, evidence gathered by someone who knew the value of leverage in a world where knowledge was the ultimate currency. Margin notes in several files were in the same handwriting, suggesting a single collector had assembled this archive carefully over many years. One document changed everything. It was a letter dated 15 years ago from Vivian Blackwood to someone identified only as V. The letter read, "If something happens to me, everything I've collected is to go to Sarah's granddaughter. She's the only family I trust to do the right thing. The mill is wired, both for security and for destruction. If they come for the files, the evidence will survive in the dead man's switch I've installed. Rebecca should know that what we did in the old days, what we kept secret, it was to protect the country. But some secrets have become more dangerous than the truths they hide." Rebecca's heart pounded as the implications sank in. Vivian hadn't been a recluse by choice. She'd been in hiding. These files weren't stolen. They were collected by someone inside the system, someone who had participated in these operations and had grown disturbed by what she'd seen. As sunset approached, Rebecca carefully locked the filing cabinets and left the mill, her mind spinning with the magnitude of what she'd discovered. She couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe her? And more importantly, who could she trust? If these files were accurate, corruption reached into every level of government. Driving home to her children, Rebecca felt the weight of terrible knowledge settling on her shoulders. These documents could expose decades of crimes, topple governments, even prevent future atrocities, but they could also get her and her family killed. That night, after tucking Emma and Marcus into bed, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, researching Vivian Blackwood. What she found made her blood freeze. Vivian Blackwood had been a CIA analyst for 30 years, specializing in psychological operations and covert funding mechanisms. She'd had high-level security clearance and had worked on some of the most sensitive operations of the Cold War era. But in 1995, Vivian had disappeared from Washington, D.C. official records, listed her as retired, but informal inquiries suggested something more dramatic had occurred. Forum posts from intelligence community veterans hinted at a major scandal, a high-level analyst who had gone rogue with sensitive materials. Rebecca found an obituary from 2 months ago. Vivian Blackwood, 89, died at her home outside Madison, Virginia. The obituary mentioned her career as a government researcher and noted that she had lived quietly for many years, dedicated to historical preservation work. No mention of family, no details about her government service. But Rebecca also found something else, a news article from last month about a break-in at Vivian's house shortly before her death. Nothing was reported stolen, but the house had been systematically searched. Police had attributed it to vandalism, but Rebecca now suspected something far more sinister. The next morning, Rebecca called in sick to work and drove back to the mill. This time, she came prepared with better tools and a plan. If Vivian had mentioned a dead man's switch and security measures, Rebecca needed to understand what she was dealing with. In daylight, she noticed things she'd missed before. Small cameras mounted in the corners of the room, old but functional, motion sensors that were still operational. And in the back corner, hidden behind a false panel, she found Vivian's insurance policy. A sophisticated computer system, obviously installed much more recently than the filing cabinets, was connected to both the internet and to what appeared to be explosive charges placed throughout the mill. A note taped to the monitor read, "Rebecca, if you're reading this, then my death was not natural. The system is set to upload everything to major news outlets worldwide if tampered with or if I fail to check in for more than 60 days. You now have 45 days to decide what to do with 30 years of American secrets. Choose wisely. The password is your grandmother's maiden name plus the year the mill was built, 1847. Remember, these people will kill to keep their secrets, but the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Make sure you're ready for the consequences of whatever choice you make. VB. Rebecca's hands trembled as she entered the password, Morrison 1847. The computer screen flickered to life, revealing a countdown timer, 44 days, 17 hours, 32 minutes. She was now the keeper of secrets that could reshape American history, expose, or crimes that went to the highest levels of government and potentially save future lives by preventing the continuation of illegal operations. But she was also a single mother with 2 children to protect, working 2 jobs with no powerful allies and no idea whom she could trust. As Rebecca stared at the countdown timer, she realized her life had just changed forever. The worthless mill she'd inherited wasn't worthless at all. It was the most dangerous piece of property in America. And she had just over 6 weeks to decide whether to expose truths that powerful people had literally killed to keep hidden, or to somehow make this all disappear and save her own family. The choice she made in the coming days would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of a democracy built on secrets that should never have been kept. Rebecca Torres, single mother of 2, former nursing student, had just become the most dangerous woman in America. She just didn't know it yet. Walking back to her car, Rebecca noticed tire tracks in the mud that hadn't been there the day before. Fresh tracks from a large vehicle, maybe a van or SUV. Someone else had been here, and recently. Her phone, buzzing with a text message from an unknown number, made her freeze. "We know you've been to the mill. We know what you found. If you want to keep your children safe, you'll forget what you've seen. This is your only warning." Rebecca's blood ran cold as she realized that whatever security measures Vivian had built into the system, they hadn't. Kept it secret from everyone. Powerful people knew about the files, knew she'd found them, and were already moving to contain the situation. Racing back to her car, Rebecca's mind spun with fear and determination. She thought of Emma's serious little face, of Marcus's infectious laugh, of all the dreams she'd had for their future. She thought of Vivian Blackwood, who had spent 28 years in hiding, gathering evidence of crimes that reached into the heart of American power. As she drove away from the mill, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to run, and she wasn't going to hide these documents. She was going to find a way to expose the truth, protect her family, and honor Vivian's sacrifice. But first, she needed help. And in a world where she couldn't trust the government, the police, or even her own extended family, Rebecca would have to find allies in the most unexpected places. The countdown continued ticking. 44 days, 16 hours, 55 minutes. Rebecca spent the next 3 days in a state of barely controlled panic, jumping at every unexpected sound, checking and rechecking the locks on her doors, and watching her children with the desperate intensity of a mother protecting cubs. The EE text message had shaken her more than the discovery itself. It proved that whoever had left her the files knew she'd found them and were actively monitoring her movements. But on Thursday morning, as she served breakfast to Emma and Marcus before school, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to live in fear. Vivian Blackwood had spent 28 years gathering evidence of crimes that needed to be exposed, and she'd entrusted that evidence to Rebecca for a reason. After dropping the kids at school, Rebecca drove not to the mill, but to the University of Virginia library. If she was going to understand what she'd found, She needed to research the historical context of these operations. More importantly, she needed to figure out how to safely expose the truth without getting herself and her children killed. The university's archives contained extensive collections on Cold War history, intelligence operations, and government. Accountability. Rebecca spent hours poring over books about CIA operations, congressional investigations into intelligence abuses, and the journalists who'd exposed previous government scandals. She learned about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, about Seymour Hersh's exposés of CIA domestic spying, about the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s. But she also learned about the people who had died trying to expose inconvenient truths, journalists who'd suffered mysterious accidents, whistleblowers who'd been charged with treason, sources who'd simply disappeared. The message was clear. Exposing government secrets was dangerous, even in a democracy. While researching, Rebecca noticed a familiar name in an article about investigative journalism: Dr. Michael Chen, a professor of journalism and ethics at UVA who specialized in national security reporting and whistleblower protection. The article mentioned his work with established journalists who'd successfully exposed government malfeasance while protecting their sources. Rebecca spent the afternoon reading Dr. Chen's published papers on secure communication methods, legal protections for whistleblowers, and strategies for safely releasing sensitive information. His work suggested that timing, method, and coalition building were crucial for successful exposure of government misconduct. That evening, Rebecca made her first move. Using an encrypted email service from the public library, she sent a carefully worded message to Dr. Chen. "I've come across historical documents that appear to contain evidence of government operations that may have violated both domestic and international law. I need guidance on how to verify their authenticity, and if they prove genuine, how to safely bring them to public attention. I'm not an activist or political operative. I'm a nursing student who inherited these materials and believes the public has a right to know about possible crimes committed in their name." Dr. Chen's response came within hours. "Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the Grounds for Thought Cafe on University Avenue. Bring a sample document. Nothing that could compromise anyone's safety. Come alone and make sure you're not followed. If this concerns what I think it might, you're right to be careful." Rebecca spent that night making copies of several less sensitive documents, choosing files that demonstrated the nature of the archive without revealing the most damaging information. She barely slept, alternating between excitement at finally having someone to help and terror at what she was setting in motion. The meeting with Dr. Chen exceeded her expectations. A soft-spoken man in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He examined the documents she'd brought with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating classified materials. His face grew increasingly serious as he read. "My God," he whispered, looking up at Rebecca with a mixture of respect and concern. "Where did you get these?" Rebecca told him about Vivian, the mill, and the archive. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed his deep understanding of intelligence operations and government secrecy. "Rebecca, you've stumbled onto what could be the most significant national security leak since the Pentagon Papers," he said finally. "These documents, if they're authentic, and they appear to be, contain evidence of operations that Congress was never told about, activities that violated multiple laws, and cover-ups that reach into the current administration." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "But you need to understand what you're up against. Some of the people implicated in these files are still alive, still powerful, and still very dangerous. They have the resources of intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and private security firms at their disposal. They will try to discredit you, destroy the evidence, and if necessary, eliminate you." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine, but also a surge of determination. Dr. Chen, I've read enough of these files to know that people, Americans, innocent people, were murdered, tortured, and experimented on by their own government. How can I just walk away knowing that? Dr. Chen smiled sadly. That's exactly what Vivian Blackwood must have thought 30 years ago. The question is, how do we honor that commitment while keeping you and your children alive? Over the next hour, Dr. Chen outlined a strategy that was both audacious and carefully planned. Rather than trying to expose everything at once, which would likely result in the documents being suppressed and Rebecca being arrested or worse, they would build a coalition of journalists, legal experts, and foreign allies who could help authenticate and release the information simultaneously across multiple platforms and jurisdictions. The key, Dr. Chen explained, is to make the information too widespread to suppress and to have legal protections in place before we begin. We need the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian in London, Der Spiegel in Germany, and at least one major television network. We need constitutional lawyers ready to defend you, and we need copies of everything hidden in multiple, secure locations. Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was proposing, but also relieved to finally have a plan. What do I do first? First, we verify everything. I have contacts who can authenticate documents, cross-reference operations with known historical events, and confirm identities of people mentioned in the files. Then we start building our coalition very carefully, very quietly. Dr. Chen handed her an encrypted phone. Use this when you need to contact me. Change your patterns. Shop at different stores. Take different routes to work. Vary your schedule. If anyone approaches you claiming to be from the government, demand to see identification and insist on having a lawyer present before you say anything. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Chen placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. I want you to understand something, Rebecca. What you're doing takes incredible courage. Most people would just walk away, pretend they'd never seen those files. But democracy depends on people like you, people who choose to do the right thing even when it's dangerous. Over the next week, Rebecca threw herself into the work of documenting and organizing the archive. She returned to the mill each day, carefully photographing documents, creating digital copies, and organizing files by operation, date, and level of sensitivity. The more she read, the more horrified she became. Operation Midnight Sun wasn't just about psychological experiments. It was about creating mind-controlled assassins, people who could be programmed to kill and then have no memory of their actions. The program had been tested on prisoners, mental patients, and even some military volunteers who thought they were participating in medical research. Operation Silver Shield involved manipulating elections in Allied countries, assassinating democratically elected leaders who were deemed unfriendly to American interests, and installing dictators who would provide favorable trade terms. Countries she'd thought of as allies had been infiltrated and manipulated by American intelligence. Operation Ghostwalker was perhaps the most chilling. It detailed a systematic program of eliminating American citizens who posed threats to national security. Not foreign spies or terrorists, but journalists, activists, congressional staffers, and even some government employees who had asked too many questions. Each file contained photographs, surveillance reports, and terse notes like "problem resolved" or "permanent solution implemented." But Rebecca also found something that gave her hope. Vivian's personal notes were scattered throughout the files, and they told the story of a woman who had grown increasingly horrified by what she was helping to facilitate. Starting in the 1970s, Vivian had begun making copies of everything, documenting not just the operations, but the decision-making process, the cover-ups, and the people responsible. One note dated 1985 read, "I joined the agency to serve my country, to protect democracy, but we've become everything we claim to be fighting against. We torture, we murder, we manipulate elections, we experiment on our own people. How is this different from what the Soviets do? At least they don't pretend to be the good guys." Another from 1990, Senator Morrison started asking questions about missing budget allocations. He's getting too close to Operation Silver Shield. Director Patterson says Morrison might need to have an accident. "I can't be part of this anymore. I've seen the photos from the Guatemala operation. Children were killed. American senators are being threatened. We've lost our souls." The final note, dated 1994, just months before Vivian disappeared, was the most revealing. "I've made my decision. I'm going to gather everything I can and disappear. If something happens to me, if they figure out what I'm doing, I need someone on the outside to continue this work." Sarah's granddaughter seems like a fighter. Her grandmother had that same look in her eyes, that refusal to back down from what's right. "The mill will be my insurance policy. Democracy shouldn't survive on lies." Reading Vivian's notes, Rebecca understood that she wasn't just inheriting an archive. She was inheriting a mission. Vivian had spent 28 years in exile, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Now that moment had come, and Rebecca was the instrument of that exposure. Dr. Chen's contacts began verifying the document's authenticity. The results were unambiguous. Everything was genuine. CIA veterans confirmed operational details that had never been publicly released. Historians found correlations between documented activities and unexplained political events from the Cold War era. Forensic experts confirmed that the papers, inks, and seals were authentic to their respective time periods. Meanwhile, Rebecca's life continued its double existence. By day, she was a struggling single mother working double shifts at the diner, helping Emma with homework, driving Marcus to soccer practice, smiling through parent-teacher conferences where she had to explain why she couldn't afford the field. Trip fees. By night, she was documenting crimes against humanity and building a coalition to expose them. The strain was enormous. Rebecca lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, and found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. But she also discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Each horrific document she catalogued, each crime she documented, strengthened her resolve to see this through. 2 weeks after her first meeting with Dr. Chen, Rebecca received another text from the unknown number. "You haven't been to the mill in 3 days. We know you're talking to someone at the university. This is your final warning. Walk away now or face the consequences." Instead of frightening her, the message confirmed that she was on the right track. They were watching her, which meant they were worried. If the files were worthless, if there was nothing to hide, why would they be threatening her? Rebecca showed the message to Dr. Chen, who immediately upgraded their security protocols. "We're accelerating the timeline," he told her. "I've been in touch with investigative teams at 5 major news organizations. They're ready to send their best people to examine the documents, but we need to move the archives to a secure location." "What kind of secure location?" Rebecca asked. "The university has a privately funded center for investigative journalism that was specifically designed to handle sensitive documents. It's physically secure, legally protected, and has communications equipment that can't be monitored. We'll move everything there this weekend." As they planned the transfer, Rebecca felt a mixture of excitement and terror. Once the documents left the mill, there would be no going back. The countdown Vivian had built into her system would expire, and the automatic release of information would be triggered. Rebecca would no longer be able to control what happened to the files, or to herself. That Friday evening, Rebecca sat with Emma and Marcus in their small apartment, helping them with homework, as she did every night. Looking at their faces, so innocent and trusting, she felt the weight of her decision crushing down on her. Was she putting them at risk by pursuing this? Would they be safer if she just destroyed the files and disappeared? But then she thought about the photographs in Operation Ghostwalker, American citizens who had been murdered for asking questions. She thought about the mind control experiments conducted on people who trusted their government. She thought about the children killed in Guatemala, the democratically elected leaders assassinated, the decades of lies told to the American people. Emma looked up from her math homework. "Mom, is everything okay? You seem worried about something." Rebecca smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about some big decisions." "What kind of decisions?" Rebecca considered how to answer. Finally, she said, "Sometimes, honey, we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks." Emma nodded seriously. "Like when I saw Jake cheating on the test and I told Mrs. Peterson. I knew he might be mad at me, but it wasn't fair to the other kids." "Exactly like that," Rebecca said, her heart swelling with pride. Her 10-year-old daughter understood integrity in a way that some adults never would. Saturday morning arrived grey and drizzly. Dr. Chen had assembled a team for the transfer: 2 investigative journalists, a constitutional lawyer, a computer security expert, and a former CIA analyst who had become a vocal critic of intelligence overreach. They would use 3 vehicles to move the files, following different routes to the university. Rebecca met the team at a storage facility where Dr. Chen had rented space as a staging area. As she watched these experienced, committed professionals preparing to risk their careers and possibly their lives to expose the truth, Rebecca felt less alone than she had in months. Sarah Martinez, an investigative reporter from the Washington Post, approached Rebecca as they loaded boxes. "Dr. Chen told me about your situation. I want you to know that what you're doing takes incredible guts. Most people would have destroyed those files or sold them to the highest bidder." "I couldn't live with myself if I did that," Rebecca replied. "Too many people have died to keep these secrets. It's time for the truth." The transfer went smoothly, but as they unloaded the last boxes at the university facility, Rebecca noticed a black sedan parked across the street with 2 men inside watching them. Dr. Chen noticed too and quietly alerted building security. "From this point forward," he told Rebecca, "you and your children are under protective surveillance. We've arranged for former FBI agents to monitor your apartment and the kids' school. If anyone approaches you, if anything seems unusual, call me immediately." That night, as Rebecca tucked Emma and Marcus into bed, she knew their lives were about to change forever. In less than 48 hours, the world would learn about Operation Midnight Sun, Operation Silver Shield, and Operation Ghostwalker. Democracy would be tested in ways it hadn't been since Watergate. Rebecca stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet suburban street where she'd tried to build a normal life for her children. Tomorrow, that normalcy would end. She would become a public figure, a target, and possibly a hero. But tonight, she was still just a single mother who had inherited her grandmother's sister's mill and discovered that sometimes the most unlikely people are called to do extraordinary things. Sometimes struggling nursing students become the guardians of democracy. Sometimes worthless property contains the most valuable truth. Rebecca thought about Vivian Blackwood, alone in that mill for nearly 3 decades, keeping watch over secrets that could topple governments. Now it was Rebecca's turn to bear that responsibility. She wasn't an activist or a politician or a trained journalist. She was a woman who worked double shifts to pay rent, who worried about her children's future, who had been handed a terrible but necessary burden. As she finally fell asleep, Rebecca's last thought was of the countdown timer that had probably reached 0 hours by now. Somewhere in cyberspace, Vivian's insurance policy was activating, uploading files to news organizations around the world. There was no going back. The single mother who had inherited an old mill was about to change history. The explosion of media coverage began at exactly 6 a.m. on Monday morning, when the Washington Post, New York Times, Guardian, and Der Spiegel simultaneously published their first articles about what would become known as the Blackwood Files. Rebecca woke to find 17 missed calls on her phone, and a crowd of reporters gathered outside her apartment building. Within hours, the story had gone viral across social media platforms. Blackwood Files and Operation Midnight Sun were trending worldwide. The revelations were staggering. Documented proof of illegal human experimentation, assassination programs targeting American citizens, election manipulation in allied countries, and cover-ups reaching into the current administration. Dr. Chen called Rebecca immediately. "Stay put. Don't leave your apartment. We have security teams en route, and legal counsel is on standby. The government's response is going to be swift and probably aggressive." By noon, FBI agents had surrounded the university facility where the documents were being analyzed. Government lawyers were in federal court seeking injunctions to stop publication of additional information. The White House press secretary faced a barrage of questions about operations that officially never existed, but something remarkable began happening. Instead of the expected government crackdown successfully suppressing the story, the revelations gained momentum. International allies who had been secretly manipulated by American intelligence began declassifying their own files, providing corroboration for events described in the Blackwood Archive. Human rights organizations filed lawsuits demanding full disclosure of Operation Midnight Sun experiments and their victims. Rebecca watched the coverage from her living room, Emma and Marcus beside her on the couch. The children didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the magnitude of the moment. When Rebecca's photo appeared on CNN, Marcus pointed excitedly, "Mom, you're on TV." "Yes, sweetheart," Rebecca replied, pulling him closer. "Sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things." The public response was unlike anything Rebecca had anticipated. Social media filled with messages of support from people around the world. "Thank you." Rebecca began trending alongside the files themselves. Veterans who had been subjected to military experiments came forward with their stories. Families of journalists who had died under suspicious circumstances shared their long-held suspicions, but the personal cost was immediate and overwhelming. Rebecca lost her job at the diner when protesters and reporters made normal operations impossible. The children's school asked them to stay home for security reasons, which everyone understood meant because your mother is now the most controversial person in America. Dr. Chen arranged for Rebecca and the children to be relocated to a secure facility at the university. It was comfortable, but felt like protective custody. Rebecca struggled with the isolation and the constant security presence, but she found strength in letters and emails from ordinary citizens who told her she was giving voice to their long-held suspicions about government overreach. One letter particularly moved her. It came from Maria Santos, a woman whose son had been a subject in military psychological experiments in the 1980s. "For 30 years I've been told I was crazy, that my son's death was suicide, that the military couldn't have done the things I witnessed. Your courage has given me hope that the truth can finally come out." The legal battles intensified daily. The Justice Department filed charges against Rebecca under the Espionage Act, claiming she had violated national security laws by possessing and distributing classified materials. But constitutional lawyers from around the country volunteered to defend her, arguing that the documents revealed crimes that transcended classification levels. Federal Judge Patricia Brooks became a crucial figure in the proceedings. During a hearing on the government's attempt to seize all remaining documents, she made a statement that would be remembered in constitutional law for decades. The classification of documents cannot be used as a shield to protect criminal activity. If these files contain evidence of war crimes, human rights violations, and illegal domestic operations, the public interest in disclosure far outweighs any claimed national security concerns. The international response provided Rebecca with unexpected protection. The European Union offered her asylum, arguing that the revelations had exposed operations that violated international law and that the US government could not be trusted to fairly prosecute those responsible. Canada made a similar offer, as did several South American countries whose elections had been manipulated according to Operation Silver Shield documents. Rebecca found herself at the center of a global conversation about government accountability, democratic transparency, and the rights of whistleblowers. She gave her first interview to 60 Minutes, speaking from the secure facility with her face clearly visible, refusing to hide. "I'm not a spy or a traitor," she told correspondent Leslie Stahl. "I'm a mother who believes my children deserve to live in a country that tells the truth about its past and present. These operations weren't conducted to protect America. They were conducted to protect specific powerful interests, often at the expense of innocent lives." When Stahl asked about her fears for her family's safety, Rebecca's voice grew stronger. "Of course I'm afraid, but I'm more afraid of what happens if these crimes continue to be covered up. How many more experiments will be conducted on unwilling subjects? How many more democratically elected leaders will be assassinated? How many more American citizens will disappear for asking inconvenient questions?" The interview was watched by over 30 million people and sparked massive demonstrations in major cities. Citizens gathered at federal buildings demanding full disclosure of intelligence operations and accountability for those responsible. The movement gained momentum when prominent public figures began supporting Rebecca's actions. Senator Elizabeth Warren called for congressional hearings, stating, "These documents reveal systematic violations of domestic and international law that demand immediate investigation and prosecution." Former President Jimmy Carter, despite his advanced age, released a statement calling Rebecca a true patriot who has chosen truth over personal safety. International leaders began pressuring the US government to address the allegations seriously rather than attacking the messenger. But the pressure on Rebecca personally remained intense. Death threats arrived daily, requiring constant security presence around her family. Government officials made public statements questioning her motives and mental stability. Anonymous sources leaked information about her divorce, her financial struggles, and her children's school records in attempts to discredit her. Emma, now understanding more about what was happening, approached Rebecca one evening. "Mom, you sorry you found those papers?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sorry. These documents showed that people were hurt by their own government, and that's not right. Sometimes we have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." "Will we be okay?" Emma asked, her young face serious with worry. "We're going to be fine," Rebecca assured her, "and hopefully, because of what we're doing, other families will be okay too." The breakthrough came 6 weeks after the initial revelations. Dr. Robert Hayes, the former director of Operation Midnight Sun, held a press conference that shocked the intelligence community. Standing at a podium in Washington, the elderly man spoke with visible emotion about his role in the programs. "For 50 years, I've carried the guilt of what we did," Hayes said. "Rebecca Torres has given me the opportunity to finally tell the truth. Yes, we conducted illegal experiments on American citizens. Yes, we assassinated people who threatened to expose our operations. Yes, we manipulated elections and overthrew governments. And yes, We've spent decades covering it up. Hayes revealed additional details that corroborated everything in the Blackwood files and provided new information about ongoing operations. His testimony opened the floodgates, and other former operatives began coming forward with their own confessions. Congressional hearings that followed were unlike anything since Watergate. Committee rooms packed with victims' families, international observers and media from around the world watched as witness after witness confirmed the allegations in the Blackwood files. Rebecca testified for 8 hours over 2 days, remaining calm and factual as congressmen grilled her about everything from her motivations to the authenticity of the documents. Representative Adam Schiff, chairing the House Intelligence Committee investigation, praised Rebecca's testimony. "Mrs. Torres, you have shown extraordinary courage in bringing these crimes to light. Democracy depends on citizens like you who choose truth over convenience, justice over personal safety." The hearings revealed that many of the operations had never been authorized by Congress, that millions of taxpayer dollars had been spent on illegal activities, and that several current government officials had knowledge of ongoing crimes and had done nothing to stop them. International pressure mounted as allies demanded explanations for operations conducted on their soil without their knowledge. The International Criminal Court announced investigations into war crimes revealed in the documents. The United Nations called for a complete review of American intelligence operations worldwide. Rebecca found herself transformed from a struggling single mother into an international symbol of government accountability. Universities offered her honorary degrees. Human rights organizations honored her with awards, and publishing houses competed for the rights to her story. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. The families of victims from Operation Midnight Sun formed support groups that connected with Rebecca regularly. Veterans who had been unwilling subjects in experiments found community with other survivors. Citizens of countries whose governments had been overthrown by American operations thanked her for revealing the truth about their histories. Rebecca established the Vivian Blackwood Foundation for Government Transparency, using donations from supporters worldwide to fund legal aid for whistleblowers, support for families of intelligence operation victims, and education programs about civil liberties and government accountability. The legal proceedings continued for months, but Rebecca's actions had fundamentally changed the national conversation. Opinion polls showed that a majority of Americans supported full disclosure of the operations revealed in the Blackwood files, even if it embarrassed the government internationally. Several high-ranking intelligence officials were indicted on charges ranging from obstruction of justice to crimes against humanity. The directors of all major intelligence agencies were replaced, and new oversight mechanisms were established to prevent future abuses. Rebecca moved her family back to Virginia, to a house purchased with donations from supporters. She enrolled in law school, deciding that her experience had shown her how much the country needed advocates for government transparency. Emma and Marcus returned to regular school, where their teachers made their mother's actions the centerpiece of civics. Lessons about courage and civic responsibility. On the 1-year anniversary of finding the files, Rebecca returned to the mill with Dr. Chen and her children. The site had been converted into a memorial and educational center, with plaques honoring both Vivian Blackwood and the victims of the operations revealed in the files. Standing before the memorial, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed. A year ago, she had been a woman struggling to pay rent and raise her children alone. Now she was studying law while working to reform intelligence oversight. Her children were thriving in school, and she had played a role in exposing some of the darkest chapters in American history. "Mom," Marcus asked, Do you think Great-Aunt Vivian would be proud of what you did?" Rebecca smiled, looking at the memorial dedicated to the woman she'd never met, but whose courage had changed her life. "I think she would be, sweetheart. She spent her whole life gathering evidence of these crimes, waiting for the right moment to expose them. She trusted our family to continue that work." Emma, now 12 and more politically aware, asked the deeper question: "Do you think things will really change? Will the government stop doing bad things just because everyone knows about them now?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "I don't know, honey, but I know that democracy only works when citizens hold their government accountable. What we did, what Vivian did, made it harder for these kinds of operations to continue in secret. That's how democracy stays healthy, through people who refuse to look the other way when they see something wrong." Dr. Chen, who had become a close family friend and advisor, reflected on the broader impact. "Rebecca, you've fundamentally changed how Americans think about government transparency. The Blackwood Act that Congress passed requires automatic declassification of intelligence operations after 20 years, unless specific national security exemptions are approved by multiple congressional committees. That wouldn't have happened without your courage." As they drove home, Rebecca felt a sense of completion that had eluded her throughout the intense year of revelations, hearings, and legal battles. She had inherited more than land from Vivian Blackwood. She had inherited a mission to seek truth and justice, regardless of personal cost. The mill stood as a monument to both women. Vivian, who had sacrificed a normal life to document crimes against democracy, and Rebecca, who had chosen to risk everything to ensure those crimes finally came to light. Together, they had proven that ordinary citizens could hold the most powerful institutions accountable when they chose courage over comfort. The single mother who had inherited worthless land had discovered something far more valuable than CIA secrets or government scandals. She had discovered that democracy depends on individuals willing to risk everything for the principle that truth must triumph over power, regardless of the personal cost. As Rebecca tucked Emma and Marcus into bed that night, she knew that their family story would inspire future generations of citizens to demand transparency from their government. The mill had been just the beginning. The real inheritance was the knowledge that even the most powerful secrets could not withstand the courage of someone determined to expose the truth. The American people had been reminded that in a democracy, the ultimate power belongs to citizens brave enough to use it, even when those citizens are single mothers from small Virginia towns who just happened to inherit the right piece of land at exactly the right moment in history. 5 years after the Blackwood Files changed American intelligence forever, Rebecca Torres stood before the graduating class of Georgetown University Law School, preparing to deliver the commencement address. At 37, she had become one of the nation's most prominent advocates for government transparency and civil liberties. Her journey from struggling single mother to constitutional lawyer inspiring millions worldwide. The university's decision to invite Rebecca had sparked some controversy among alumni, but the students had overwhelmingly supported the choice. As she looked out at the sea of faces in their caps and gowns, Rebecca saw not just future lawyers, but future guardians of democracy who would carry forward the lessons learned from the mill those transformative years ago. 5 years ago, Rebecca began, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "I was cleaning offices at night and serving coffee during the day, wondering how I was going to pay for my children's school supplies. I thought the most significant decision I'd make was whether to sell a piece of worthless land or let the county take it for back taxes. I never imagined that Old Mill would teach me the most important lesson of my life, that ordinary citizens have extraordinary power when they choose to use it." The audience which included Emma and Marcus in the front row, now 15 and 13 respectively, listened intently as Rebecca continued. Law school taught me about constitutional principles, but experience taught me about constitutional courage. The two are inseparable. Knowledge without action is just academic exercise. Action without knowledge is just noise. But when you combine legal understanding with moral conviction, you become an unstoppable force for justice. Rebecca's law career had exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. After graduating summa cum laude from the University of Virginia, she had clerked for Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan before founding the Constitutional Accountability Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating government overreach and protecting whistleblowers. The organization had grown into a powerhouse with offices in 12 countries and a staff of over 200 lawyers, investigators, and researchers. The impact of the Blackwood files continued to reverberate globally. International courts had prosecuted dozens of former American intelligence officials for war crimes. Allied nations had declassified their own files revealing collaboration with illegal American operations, leading to government reforms across Europe and Latin America. The United Nations had established new protocols for intelligence oversight that became the global standard, but the domestic changes were perhaps even more significant. The Intelligence Oversight Reform Act, known colloquially as the Blackwood Act, had fundamentally restructured how American intelligence agencies operated. Congressional oversight was now mandatory for all operations, with automatic declassification requirements and whistleblower protections that actually worked. 3. Intelligence directors had been prosecuted and imprisoned, sending a clear message that accountability applied to everyone. Rebecca's organization had handled over 500 cases involving government transparency, winning landmark rulings that expanded press freedoms, protected government employees who exposed wrongdoing, and forced declassification of historical documents that shed light on decades of hidden operations. Each victory built upon the precedent established by the Mill discovery. The personal toll had been significant, but ultimately strengthening. Rebecca had faced 3 assassination attempts, countless death threats, and ongoing surveillance by hostile intelligence services. But she had also received support from unexpected quarters. Former CIA Director Jennifer Walsh, who had been instrumental in implementing reforms, had become a close ally and friend. International leaders regularly consulted Rebecca on intelligence oversight matters. Harvard had established the Torres Chair in Constitutional Law, the first endowed position dedicated specifically to government accountability. Emma and Marcus had grown up at the center of this transformation, becoming articulate advocates for transparency and justice in their own right. Emma, now a sophomore at MIT studying computer science and civil liberties, had developed encryption software used by journalists and activists worldwide. Marcus, an 8th grader with his mother's moral clarity and his father's analytical mind, already spoke at local schools about civic responsibility and constitutional rights. The family dynamic had evolved in ways Rebecca never could have anticipated. David, her ex-husband, had initially been terrified by the attention and danger surrounding Rebecca's actions. But as the years passed and he watched his children develop into thoughtful, engaged citizens, he had come to respect what Rebecca had accomplished. He had remarried but remained an active co-parent, and his new wife had become a supporter of Rebecca's work. The Mill itself had become an internationally recognized center for government accountability education. The Vivian Blackwood Institute for Democratic Oversight operated year-round programs for journalists, lawyers, government, employees, and citizens interested in understanding their rights and responsibilities in a democracy. Over 100,000 people visited annually, making it one of Virginia's top educational tourism destinations. Rebecca often brought visiting international delegations to the mill, showing them the room where Vivian had maintained her vigil for nearly 3 decades, and the space where Rebecca had first discovered the files that changed everything. The story resonated across cultures because it spoke to universal human values: the courage to stand up to power, the importance of holding leaders accountable, and the idea that ordinary people could reshape history. The economic transformation of the surrounding community had been remarkable. The small town of Madison had evolved from a struggling rural community to a thriving hub of non-profit organizations, think tanks, and educational institutions drawn by the mill's reputation. Local unemployment had dropped to near zero. Property values had increased dramatically, and young people who had left for opportunities elsewhere began returning to be part of the democratic renewal movement centered at the mill. Rebecca had used her speaking fees and book royalties to establish scholarship programs that sent local students to college with full funding, requiring only that they spend 2 years after graduation working in public service. The program had already sent over 200 students to universities across the country, many of whom returned to contribute to the community's continued growth. The international impact continued to expand. The model of citizen accountability that Rebecca represented had inspired similar movements worldwide. In Brazil, a fisherman's discovery of documents revealing corruption in the state oil company had led to the prosecution of 3 former presidents. In Nigeria, a teacher's exposure of military human rights violations had prompted comprehensive security sector reforms. In Poland, a librarian's revelation of surveillance program documents had strengthened democratic institutions and press freedoms. Rebecca regularly received invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and government institutions around the world. Her message was consistent. Democracy required active citizenship, not passive observation. The founders of America designed a system that depends on informed, engaged citizens holding their government accountable, she would tell audiences. They knew that power corrupts, and they built checks and balances into our system, but those checks and balances only work when citizens activate them. The technological implications of the Blackwood revelations had been profound. Emma's encryption software had been just one result of increased awareness about government surveillance capabilities. The files had revealed extensive domestic spying programs that violate constitutional protections, leading to major reforms in how intelligence agencies could collect and store data on American citizens. Silicon Valley companies had initially resisted transparency requirements, arguing that national security cooperation required secrecy. But public pressure following the Blackwood revelations had forced tech giants to be more transparent about government data requests and to build stronger privacy protections into their systems. The result was a generation of digital tools that better protected civil liberties while still allowing legitimate law enforcement operations. The legal precedents established through Rebecca's cases had become standard curriculum in law schools nationwide. The Torres doctrine held that citizens who exposed evidence of criminal activity by their government could not be prosecuted under espionage laws, regardless of the classification level of the documents involved. The Supreme Court had unanimously upheld this principle, fundamentally changing how whistleblower protections worked. Rebecca's influence extended beyond law and policy into popular culture. Her story had been adapted into a critically acclaimed film that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. The movie, titled The Mill, starring Lupita Nyong'o as Rebecca, had sparked renewed interest in civic engagement among young people worldwide. A generation of teenagers now knew Rebecca's story better than they knew many historical events, and civic engagement among 18 to 25-year-olds had reached levels not seen since the 1960s. As Rebecca concluded her commencement address, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. You are graduating into a world where transparency is no longer optional, where citizens expect accountability, and where courage is measured not by the risks you avoid, but by the principles you defend. Each of you has the power to be the person who stands up when others sit down, who speaks truth when others remain silent, who chooses justice when others choose convenience. She paused, looking directly at Emma and Marcus in the front row. The mill taught me that we don't inherit the world from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. Every decision we make, every stand we take, every act of courage or cowardice shapes the world we leave behind. Make sure it's a world where truth matters more than power, where justice prevails over convenience, and where ordinary citizens can still accomplish extraordinary things. The standing ovation lasted for over 10 minutes, but Rebecca was focused on the faces of the young graduates. These were the people who would lead the next generation of democratic reform, who would face new challenges she couldn't imagine, who would need to find their own courage when confronted with their own moments of truth. After the ceremony, Rebecca walked through the university campus with Emma and Marcus, reflecting on how much their lives had changed. They passed students reading books about constitutional law, discussing cases that had emerged from the mill discovery, debating the balance between security and transparency that would define their generation's approach to governance. "Mom," Emma said, "do you ever wish you had just sold the mill and never found those files?" Rebecca smiled, the same question her daughter had asked years ago, but now with a more sophisticated understanding of its implications. Never. Yes, our lives would have been simpler, safer, more predictable, but they wouldn't have been meaningful. In the same way, we learned that we could make a difference, that ordinary people like us could help democracy work better. That's worth every challenge we faced. Marcus, now 13 and already showing signs of his own social justice orientation, asked the harder question. "But Mom, are there still secret operations happening now? Are there still people who need someone like you to expose them?" Rebecca nodded seriously. "Probably. Power always tries to hide from accountability. That's why we built institutions and trained people and created legal protections. The mill was just the beginning. Democracy is like a garden. You can't plant it once and expect it to thrive forever. It requires constant tending, constant vigilance, constant courage from ordinary citizens." As they reached Rebecca's car, she looked back at the university where she had just challenged 500 new lawyers to use their education for public good. Tomorrow, she would return to her office at the Constitutional Accountability Project, where a dozen new cases waited for her attention. There would be more government employees ready to expose wrongdoing, more documents that shed light on hidden operations, more opportunities to strengthen democratic institutions. The mill had given Rebecca more than files. It had given her a purpose that transformed not just her own life, but the concept of citizenship itself. She had proven that democracy's greatest strength lay not in its institutions, but in its people. Not in its laws, but in citizens brave enough to enforce them. Not in its tradition, but in its constant renewal through acts of individual courage. Driving home through the Virginia countryside, passing the exit that led to the mill, now marked with brown historical markers directing visitors to the Blackwood Institute, Rebecca felt the satisfaction of a mission that had grown far beyond anything Vivian could have imagined. The single mother who had inherited worthless land had transformed it into a symbol of citizen power that inspired democratic movements across the globe. That evening, Rebecca sat in her study working on legislation that would further strengthen whistleblower protections, while Emma coded new privacy tools for activists, and Marcus researched famous cases of civil disobedience for a school project. 3 generations of American citizens, each in their own way, continuing the work that had started in an abandoned mill, with one woman's courage to gather evidence of wrongdoing and another woman's courage to expose it. The Blackwood Files had closed, but the story they started continued to write itself through every citizen who chose accountability over apathy, truth over comfort, justice over convenience. Rebecca had learned that the most valuable inheritance wasn't property or money. It was the knowledge that individual action could bend the arc of history toward justice, and that democracy depended on ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things when history called upon them. The mill stood as proof that in America, the most powerful person was still the citizen brave enough to act on principle, regardless of the cost. And in a world where democracy faced new challenges daily, that lesson remained more relevant than ever. The single mother's journey from struggling to pay rent to transforming constitutional law had become a permanent part of American history, inspiring future generations to find their own mills, their own moments of truth, their own opportunities. To prove that in a democracy, the people truly held the ultimate power, if they were brave enough to use it. 10 years had transformed Rebecca Torres from a woman struggling to survive into one of the most influential figures in modern democratic reform. Now 42, she stood in the United Nations headquarters in New York, about to address the General Assembly on the 10th anniversary of the Blackwood Files revelation. The girl who had once worried about paying for her children's school supplies now commanded the attention of world leaders as they faced new challenges to democratic governance in an increasingly complex global landscape. The decade since the mill discovery had seen Rebecca evolve from reluctant whistleblower to global democracy advocate, author, and reform architect. Her constitutional accountability project had grown into an international network, with offices on every continent, employing over 800 people and managing a budget exceeding $50 million annually. More importantly, it had become the gold standard for government transparency organizations worldwide. The speech she was about to deliver would introduce the Global Democracy Charter, a document she had spent 3 years developing with democratic leaders, constitutional scholars, and transparency advocates from 47 countries. The Charter represented the next evolution of the principles first embodied in the Blackwood Revelations, a comprehensive framework for government accountability that could be adapted to any political system while maintaining core democratic values. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had faced down intelligence agencies and emerged stronger. 10 years ago, I inherited a piece of land that everyone considered worthless. Today, I stand before you to discuss something infinitely more valuable, the inheritance we leave to future generations of global citizens. The assembly hall was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens throughout the building. Emma, now 23 and working as a digital rights attorney for the European Union, sat in the distinguished visitors section alongside Marcus, 21, who had just completed his internship with the International Criminal Court and was preparing to start law school at Yale in the fall. Rebecca continued, "The Blackwood Files taught us that democracy cannot survive in darkness, but the past decade has taught us something even more important, that transparency alone is not enough. We must build institutions that actively engage citizens in the democratic process, that make government accountability not just possible, but inevitable." The Global Democracy Charter represented Rebecca's most ambitious project yet. Unlike traditional international agreements that focused on preventing bad behavior, the Charter created positive obligations for democratic engagement. Signatory nations committed to regular citizen oversight panels, mandatory government transparency, reports, and protection for citizens who exposed official wrongdoing. Most revolutionary was the establishment of transnational accountability mechanisms that allowed citizens of one country to hold other governments accountable for actions affecting global democratic norms. The response to the Charter had been overwhelming. 47 nations had already signed, representing every continent and every major form of democratic government. Perhaps more surprisingly, several countries transitioning from authoritarian rule had specifically requested assistance implementing Charter principles, seeing them as essential to building trust with their populations. Rebecca's personal journey had been as remarkable as her professional achievements. After years of living with security details and constant threats, she had gradually been able to return to a more normal life as reforms took hold and many of her most dangerous enemies were prosecuted or marginalized. She had remarried 3 years ago to Dr. Samuel Okafor, a Nigerian human rights lawyer she had met during a conference on constitutional reform in Lagos. Their partnership, both personal and professional, had become a model for collaborative democracy work across cultural boundaries. Samuel had brought his own perspective to Rebecca's work, particularly insights from African democratic movements that had successfully challenged authoritarian rule through citizen engagement rather than external intervention. Together, they had developed new models for grassroots democracy building that were being implemented in transitional democracies across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The economic impact of the democratic renewal movement had been profound and largely positive. Countries that had implemented strong transparency and accountability measures consistently showed higher levels of economic growth, lower corruption, and increased foreign investment. The mill in Virginia had become a case study taught in business schools as an example of how ethical governance could drive economic development. Rebecca's hometown of Madison, Virginia, had been transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a struggling rural community was now home to the Blackwood Democracy Institute, which hosted scholars and reformers from around the world. The town's population had tripled, but careful planning had preserved its small-town character while adding modern amenities and infrastructure. Local residents, many of whom had initially been skeptical of the attention Rebecca's discovery had brought, now served as tour guides, teachers, and administrators at various democracy-focused institutions. The educational programs at the mill had evolved far beyond Rebecca's initial vision. The institute now offered degree programs in partnership with major universities, trained thousands of government employees annually, and had become a required stop for American diplomats before overseas assignments. International students comprised nearly half of the institute's enrollment, creating a global network of democracy practitioners who maintained connections throughout their careers. But Rebecca's proudest achievement was the Citizen Advocates Network, a global organization of ordinary people trained to monitor their local governments and report on transparency and accountability issues. Over 100,000 volunteers in 78 countries served as democracy watchdogs, using mobile technology and social media to keep their communities informed about government actions and to organize rapid response to potential abuses of power. The network had prevented dozens of potential democratic backslides by early detection and rapid mobilization of international pressure. When the government of a small Eastern European nation attempted to restrict press freedoms, citizen advocates documented every action and shared information globally within hours. International pressure, coordinated through the network, forced the government to withdraw the restrictions within days. Emma's work with the European Union had focused on digital rights and surveillance reform, carrying forward her mother's legacy into the digital age. Her encryption technologies were now standard tools for journalists and activists worldwide, and she had authored legislation adopted by the EU that created the strongest digital privacy protections in history. Marcus had chosen a different path, working with post-conflict societies to build democratic institutions from the ground up. His internship with the International Criminal Court had focused on cases emerging from the Blackwood files, helping prosecute war criminals and establishing precedents for accountability that would prevent future abuses. During his time in the Hague, Marcus had met survivors of Operation Midnight Sun who had become advocates for other victims of government experimentation. Their stories had reinforced his understanding of why his mother's work was so crucial and had motivated him to dedicate his career to ensuring such abuses never happened again. The scientific advances that had emerged from analyzing documents in the Blackwood files had been unexpected but significant. Researchers studying the psychological manipulation techniques documented in Operation Midnight Sun had developed new treatments for trauma and addiction. The technological specifications found in some files had advanced understanding of early computer systems and surveillance methods, leading to better privacy protections and more secure communications technologies. Dr. Chen, now in his 70s, but still active, had become the foremost academic expert on government transparency and citizen oversight. His textbook, Democracy in the Dark: Lessons from the Blackwood Files, was required reading in political science and law programs worldwide. He regularly traveled with Rebecca to conferences and training programs, their partnership having become legendary in academic and policy circles. The mill itself had undergone several expansions while maintaining its historical integrity. The original stone structure now anchored a modern complex that included archives, computer labs, conference facilities, and residential quarters for visiting scholars. Vivian's original hiding place for the files had been preserved exactly as Rebecca had found it, serving as a powerful reminder of the courage required to preserve truth in the face of overwhelming power. Tourists and pilgrims visited the mill from every corner of the globe. The guest book filled several volumes each year, with entries in dozens of languages, all expressing gratitude for the courage that had changed not just American democracy, but democratic movements worldwide. Some visitors were government officials, seeking to understand how to build trust with their populations. Others were ordinary citizens, inspired to take action in their own communities. Rebecca's speech to the UN continued, "The Global Democracy Charter represents a new understanding of sovereignty in the modern world. We recognize that democracy in one country affects democracy everywhere, that transparency cannot be selective, and that accountability cannot be reserved for the powerless while exempting the powerful." The Charter's implementation was already showing results. Countries that had signed reported increased citizen satisfaction with government services, reduced corruption, and improved international relations. More importantly, a new generation of political leaders was emerging who had been trained in Charter principles and were implementing them at every level of government. The economic benefits of transparency had become undeniable. International development organizations reported that aid money went further and accomplished more in countries with strong accountability mechanisms. Investment flows increasingly favored transparent democracies over authoritarian regimes, even when the latter offered more immediate profit opportunities. Rebecca had started writing again, working on a new book that would examine how digital technology could enhance rather than threaten democratic governance. The book would feature case studies from around the world of successful digital democracy initiatives, many of which had been inspired by the Blackwood model of citizen empowerment through information access. The legal framework Rebecca had helped establish continued to evolve. The International Court of Justice had recently ruled that governments had a positive obligation to provide citizens with access to information about their activities, establishing transparency as a fundamental human right rather than just a political privilege. Supreme Court Justice appointed 3 years ago had been Rebecca's former colleague, Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Washington Post journalist who had been part of the original team that exposed the Blackwood files. Her confirmation had demonstrated how far American political culture had shifted toward valuing transparency and accountability. As Rebecca concluded her UN speech, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 10 years ago, I thought I was simply exploring an inheritance from a relative I'd never met. Today, I understand that Vivian Blackwood didn't just leave me files. She left me a responsibility that extends to every generation that follows. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 15 minutes, with delegates from countries that had once been adversaries joining together in recognition of shared democratic values. Rebecca was approached by heads of state, Nobel laureates, and ordinary citizens who had traveled to New York specifically to attend her speech. Perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Fatima al-Rashid, a young woman from Yemen who had used charter principles to establish citizen oversight panels in refugee camps, approached Rebecca with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Torres, your courage gave my people hope that democracy could work even in the darkest circumstances. Our panels have prevented corruption, ensured fair distribution of aid, and given refugees a voice in decisions affecting their lives." That evening, Rebecca attended a dinner hosted by the Secretary-General of the United Nations in honor of the Charter's launch. Seated between the President of Ghana and the Prime Minister of Canada, she found herself discussing implementation strategies and sharing stories from the mill that illustrated the universal principles underlying the Charter. Samuel, seated across from her, caught her eye and smiled. Their partnership had shown that democracy building could bring people together across every boundary, cultural, national, and personal. Their marriage ceremony 3 years ago had been attended by democracy advocates from 6 continents, a celebration not just of their personal commitment, but of the global community they had helped build. As the evening wound down, Rebecca stood on the balcony of the UN building, looking out over New York's glittering skyline. Emma and Marcus joined her, along with Samuel and Dr. Chen. Together, they represented 3 generations united by a commitment to democratic values that transcended any single nation or tradition. "Mom," Emma said, "do you think democracy is stronger now than it was 10 years ago?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I think democracy is more conscious now. Before the Blackwood files, many people took democratic institutions for granted, assumed they would automatically continue functioning. Now we understand that democracy requires active maintenance, constant vigilance, and regular renewal. That awareness, I believe, makes democracy stronger." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "The Charter creates mechanisms for that renewal, doesn't it? Regular citizen review, mandatory transparency, protection for those who speak truth to power. It institutionalizes what you did at the mill." "That's exactly right," Rebecca replied. "The mill taught us that individual courage can change history. The Charter ensures that individual courage isn't necessary for democracy to function properly. We've built safeguards so that ordinary people can hold their governments accountable without risking everything." Dr. Chen, ever the scholar, added his perspective. "What Rebecca accomplished transformed our understanding of citizenship itself. The Charter represents the culmination of that transformation. Democracy not as something done to people by their leaders, but as something people actively participate in creating and maintaining." As they prepared to return to their hotel, Rebecca took one last look at the United Nations building. Tomorrow, representatives from around the world would begin the detailed work of implementing the Charter in their home countries. The principles first discovered in Vivian's hiding place would become the foundation for democratic governance in communities from rural Africa to urban Asia to indigenous territories in the Americas. The mill had been just the beginning. The files had revealed the corruption of the past, but the Charter would help build the transparency of the future. Rebecca Torres, who had once worried about her children's school fees, had become the architect of a new understanding of democratic governance that would influence how human beings organize their societies for generations to come. Walking through the quiet corridors of the UN building, Rebecca felt the weight and wonder of the journey that had brought her here. The single mother who had inherited a worthless mill had discovered that sometimes the most unlikely people are called to carry forward the highest aspirations of human civilization. Democracy itself had been her true inheritance, and she had spent a decade ensuring that inheritance would pass intact to those who came after. The story that began with mysterious documents hidden in a Virginia mill had become a global movement, proving that ordinary citizens armed with truth and courage could transform the world. As Rebecca fell asleep that night in her New York hotel room, she knew that somewhere in the world, someone else was making the choice to speak truth to power, to stand up for transparency, to risk comfort for justice. The mill had taught her that democracy's greatest strength lay not in its institutions, but in its people. The Charter would ensure that people always had the tools they needed to use that strength. And in making that possible, Rebecca Torres had achieved something far greater than she'd ever imagined when she first inherited that worthless piece of land. She had helped democracy itself evolve, ensuring it would flourish for generations yet to come. 15 years had passed since Rebecca Torres first discovered the hidden files in Vivian Blackwood's mill, and the world had never been more transparent or more vulnerable. Now, 47, Rebecca stood at the epicenter of a crisis that threatened to undo everything she had worked to build. The very principles of openness and accountability that had made democracy stronger had also made it more susceptible to a new form of warfare. Systematic disinformation campaigns designed to weaponize truth itself. The irony was not lost on Rebecca as she convened an emergency meeting of the Global Democracy Network in Geneva. The tools they had created to promote transparency were being used to spread lies so sophisticated that even trained experts struggled to distinguish fact from fiction. Deepfake videos showed world leaders making statements they never made. Documents that appeared identical to those that exposed government crimes were being fabricated to discredit real whistleblowers. The mill's legacy of truth-telling was under assault by the most dangerous lies in human history. We face a paradox, Rebecca addressed the assembled delegates from 73 nations. The openness we fought for is being used against us. The very networks we built to spread truth are now highways for deception, but we will not retreat into secrecy. Instead, we must evolve our understanding of truth itself. Emma, now 30 and Deputy Director of the European Union's Digital Integrity Division, presented her latest research. The scope of the problem was staggering. Artificial intelligence systems could now generate seemingly authentic government documents, create realistic audio recordings of officials saying anything, and produce video evidence of events that never happened. Traditional methods of verification were becoming obsolete in real time. "Mom," Emma said, addressing the assembly, but looking directly at Rebecca, "we're facing something unprecedented. It's not just about hiding truth anymore. It's about destroying the very concept of objective truth. People are beginning to believe that everything might be fake, which makes them unable to recognize what's real." The crisis had been building for 3 years, but reached a breaking point 6 months ago when fabricated Blackwood files began circulating online. These false documents, created with extraordinary sophistication, claimed that the original files had been propaganda created by foreign intelligence services to destabilize American democracy. The fakes were so convincing that some of the journalists who had originally reported on the authentic files began to question their own memories. Rebecca had watched in horror as 20 years of democratic progress teetered on the edge of collapse. Countries that had embraced transparency were rolling back reforms. Citizens who had once demanded accountability from their governments were now so confused by competing narratives that they were retreating into cynical apathy. The very tools meant to empower citizens were being used to paralyze them with uncertainty. But Rebecca had also watched as a new generation of advocates, trained in the principles she had helped establish, rose to meet this challenge. Marcus, now 26, and serving as special advisor to the UN Secretary-General on Information Integrity, had spent the last year developing a radical new framework for truth verification in the digital age. "We can't fight lies with silence," Marcus declared to the assembly, "but we also can't fight them with more information. We need to help people develop what I call truth resilience, the ability to navigate an environment where deception is constant and sophisticated." The solution they proposed was as revolutionary as the original Blackwood revelations had been. The Truth Resilience Project would create a global network of trained citizens who could identify and counter disinformation in real time. But unlike traditional fact-checking organizations that operated after damage was done, this network would be proactive, educational, and deeply embedded in local communities. The project built on lessons learned from the original Blackwood crisis. Just as Rebecca had needed allies to safely expose the truth about government crimes, citizens now needed allies to navigate an information environment designed to confuse and manipulate them. The network would train millions of people in source verification, critical thinking, and collaborative truth-seeking. Dr. Chen, now 85 but still sharp, had been working on what he called Transparency 2.0, systems that could maintain openness while building immunity to deception. His latest innovation was a blockchain-based verification system that could authenticate the origin and integrity of information while preserving the ability for citizens to access and share it freely. "The mill taught us that truth hidden is truth denied," Dr. Chen explained to the assembly, "but we've learned that truth without context is truth vulnerable. We must create systems that don't just reveal information, but help people understand it, verify it, and act on it responsibly." The response to the Truth Resilience Project exceeded even Rebecca's optimistic projections. Within 6 months of its launch, over 2 million people across 85 countries had completed the training program. These certified truth advocates became nodes in a global network that could detect and counter disinformation campaigns within hours of their launch. The network's first major test came during attempted election interference in Brazil. Fabricated documents claiming to show corruption by all major candidates appeared simultaneously across dozens of social media platforms. The interference campaign collapsed within hours rather than swaying the election as intended. Rebecca found herself traveling constantly, not just to manage the crisis, but to inspire a new generation of advocates who understood that defending truth required the same courage as revealing it. At a conference in Seoul, she met Dr. Jennifer Kim, a computer scientist who had developed AI systems that could identify synthetic media with 99.7% accuracy. But what impressed Rebecca most was Dr. Kim's insistence that technology alone couldn't solve the problem. Mrs. Torres, Dr. Kim explained, I can build machines that detect fake videos perfectly, but if people don't trust the machines or don't understand how they work, the technology is useless. We need human networks to make technical solutions meaningful. This insight became central to the Truth Resilience Project's evolution. Rather than relying solely on automated fact-checking, the system emphasized human judgment, community verification, and transparent processes that citizens could understand and trust. Each piece of information was evaluated not just for accuracy, but for context, intent, and potential impact. The mill itself had been upgraded to serve as the global headquarters for truth verification training. Vivian's original hiding place now housed quantum computers running verification algorithms, while the upper floors contained simulation rooms where advocates could practice identifying sophisticated disinformation in controlled environments. Rebecca often brought visiting delegations to see the evolution of the mill's mission. Standing in the same room where she had first discovered the files, she would tell them, "Vivian hid truth to preserve it. We reveal truth to protect it." The method has changed, but the courage required remains the same. The personal cost of this new phase of her mission had been significant. Rebecca and Samuel had faced coordinated attacks on their reputations that were more sophisticated than anything she had encountered during the original Blackwood crisis. Deepfake videos showed them making extremist statements, fabricated documents, suggested financial corruption in their organizations. AI-generated audio recordings created evidence of private conversations that had never taken place. But the couple had an advantage, a global network of advocates trained to detect and counter exactly these kinds of attacks. Within hours of each fabricated video or document appearing online, truth advocates had analyzed, debunked, and countered the disinformation. The attacks became case studies in the training program, making the network stronger with each assault. Emma's work with the European Union had led to the passage of the Global Information Integrity Act, landmark legislation that required social media platforms to implement verification systems for synthetic media and to provide users with tools to assess the reliability of information they encountered. The law didn't restrict speech, but required transparency about how information was created and spread. Marcus had established the International Tribunal for Information Crimes, a new institution that could prosecute individuals and organizations engaged in large-scale disinformation campaigns designed to undermine democratic processes. The tribunal's first case involved a network of state-sponsored actors who had created thousands of fake academic papers to support false claims about climate science. The economic implications of the truth crisis had been severe, but created opportunities for innovation. Companies that invested in truth verification technology saw their market value soar. Nations with strong information integrity systems attracted more foreign investment as businesses sought stable, trustworthy environments. The mill's transformation into a center for truth resilience had spawned an entire industry of verification technologies and training programs. But the most profound changes were cultural. A generation was growing up that understood that truth was not something to be passively consumed, but actively verified. Children learned source evaluation alongside mathematics. Citizens demanded transparency not just from governments, but from technology platforms, media organizations, and even their own social networks. Rebecca's latest book, Truth in the Age of Deception, had become a global bestseller, translated into 47 languages and required reading in schools across 5 continents. The book outlined practical steps individuals could take to navigate an environment where sophisticated lies were as common as sophisticated truths. At a reading in Tokyo, a high school student asked Rebecca the question that drove everything she did. "Mrs. Torres, How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know the True Resilience Project isn't itself a form of sophisticated manipulation? Rebecca smiled, recognizing her younger self in the question. You don't know, and you shouldn't just trust me. That's exactly the point. I want you to verify everything I say, check my sources, question my motives, and come to your own conclusions. Truth isn't something you accept from authority. It's something you discover through investigation and evidence. The student's follow-up question was even more profound. But if everyone questions everything, how do we ever agree on anything? How do we move forward together if we can't establish basic facts? That, Rebecca replied, is why we need systems and skills, not just skepticism. The mill taught me that truth hidden becomes truth denied. But this crisis is teaching us that truth without verification becomes truth corrupted. We must build communities of truth seekers who can work together to separate fact from fiction. The success of the Truth Resilience Project had inspired similar initiatives in fields beyond politics and current events. Medical professionals were using similar networks to combat health misinformation. Scientists were creating verification systems to maintain integrity in research. Educational institutions were training students in information literacy from elementary school through doctoral programs. Rebecca had been invited to address the World Economic Forum on the 15th anniversary of the Blackwood Files revelation. As she prepared her speech, she reflected on how the mission had evolved from exposing specific crimes to protecting the very concept of truth in democratic society. 15 years ago, she would tell the assembled global leaders, I discovered that governments could hide terrible crimes in darkness. Today, we face an enemy that hides terrible lies in plain sight. Our response must be the same: courage to confront deception, systems to preserve truth, and communities committed to distinguishing fact from fiction. The forum's theme that year was Truth and Reconciliation in the Digital Age, recognizing that democracy could not survive in an environment where citizens could not agree on basic facts. Rebecca's address would launch the next phase of global cooperation on information integrity, including the establishment of an International Truth and Reconciliation Commission modeled on post-conflict justice mechanisms, but focused on healing societies divided by disinformation. As Rebecca stood on the balcony of the mill one evening, watching the sunset over the Virginia hills, she felt the weight of a mission that had expanded far beyond anything Vivian could have imagined. Files hidden in these walls had revealed the crimes of the past, but the systems developed here would protect the truth of the future. Emma called with news that the European Union had just announced the creation of the Vivian Blackwood Truth Memorial, a monument that would honor not just the woman who preserved evidence of government crimes, but all citizens who chose truth over convenience, verification over assumption, evidence over ideology. Samuel returned from a conference in Kenya with stories of local communities using truth resilience training to protect themselves from election disinformation and health misinformation. Rural villages that had never had reliable internet access were now among the most sophisticated participants in the global truth verification network. That night, as Rebecca worked on her World Economic Forum speech, she included a passage that captured the evolution of her mission. Vivian Blackwood hid truth in darkness to preserve it for light. We must now preserve truth in light to protect it from artificial darkness. The enemy has changed, but the courage required remains the same. The mill stood not just as a monument to past revelations, but as a beacon for future truth-telling. Rebecca Torres, who had inherited worthless land and found priceless truth, had spent 15 years building a global movement that proved democracy's greatest enemy was not authoritarian forces, but the corruption of truth itself. In learning, To defend truth in the digital age, she had completed Vivian's mission while creating a new one for the generations that would follow. The single mother who had once cleaned offices and served coffee had become the guardian of truth in an age of deception, proving that the most unlikely heroes often emerge to meet the most essential challenges. The Mills legacy would endure not because of what was hidden there, but because of what had been built from those revelations, a world where truth remained possible, verifiable, and powerful enough to sustain the democratic experiment for generations. Yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.